The morning my car vanished, I thought it was a prank, the kind of stupid, low-effort prank bored neighbors pull when they have nothing better to do. But when I stepped onto my driveway with a half-drunk mug of coffee and saw nothing except 2 pale oil stains shaped exactly like my tires, my stomach dropped so hard it felt like it hit concrete, because I already knew who did it and I already knew why. And I already knew this wasn't going to end like a normal HOA argument, because nothing ever ends normal when Karen Whitfield decides she's been disrespected. I stood there longer than I should have, coffee going cold, scanning the street as if my truck might come rolling back into place if I stared hard enough. Then I heard her voice before I saw her, loud and sharp and triumphant, drifting from across the cul-de-sac where she stood with her arms crossed like she'd just won a war, her perfectly sprayed hair unmoving in the breeze, her phone already in her hand, recording, always recording, because Karen never did anything unless she could upload it later and caption it with something about community standards. She didn't say good morning, didn't say a word at all at first, just smiled, and that smile told me everything. She'd finally found a way to hurt me that she thought I couldn't undo. The reason, of course, was stupid, like all HOA wars are stupid at the start, because this whole thing had begun months earlier over parking, over the fact that my truck, an old, dented, matte green beast I'd rebuilt myself, didn't fit her vision of aesthetic harmony, even though it was legally registered, properly parked, and well within the rules she pretended to know by heart. Rules she quoted like scripture but only when they benefited her. I'd ignored her notes at first, the passive-aggressive ones slipped under my windshield wiper that said things like please be mindful of community standards and unapproved vehicles may be subject to action. Unsigned but unmistakably hers, then escalated to emails from the HOA board, emails she drafted herself because she was the board or at least acted like it, threatening fines, warnings, hearings, all for a truck that had been sitting in the same spot since before she'd even moved into the neighborhood. I'd shown up to meetings, calm, polite, documents in hand, pointing out the bylaws, pointing out the lack of any rule against my vehicle, pointing out that selective enforcement was illegal, and every time she'd smiled that same tight smile and said, "We'll look into it," which really meant, "I'll wait until I find a way to screw you." And now she had. She walked over slowly, heels clicking on the asphalt, camera still rolling, narrating for her invisible audience about how some residents refused to comply, and how difficult decisions must be made for the good of the community, and when she finally stopped in front of me she tilted her head and said, "You're welcome," like she'd done me a favor. I asked where my truck was even though I knew the answer and she said, "Towed," with a little shrug as if it were no more significant than taking out the trash, then added, "Unapproved commercial vehicle," which was a lie she'd been practicing for weeks, and when I told her it wasn't commercial she laughed and said, "Tell it to the judge." The problem for Karen, though she didn't know it yet, was that I'd spent the last decade telling things to judges for a living, just not about HOA nonsense, and as angry as I was, as much as my hands shook, a colder, more dangerous calm settled in, the kind that only comes when you realize someone has crossed a line they don't understand. I went inside, set my mug down untouched, and started making calls, first to the towing company listed on the bright orange notice now taped to my mailbox, where I learned they'd been instructed to remove my truck, immediately under threat of contract termination. Then to the HOA's management company who pretended ignorance until I mentioned lawyers, then to my own attorney who sighed when I said HOA, and then got very quiet when I explained what they'd done without proper notice or authority. By noon, Karen had posted a video to the neighborhood group bragging about enforcement in action, and by 1 o'clock, half the neighborhood was arguing in the comments, some cheering her on, others asking uncomfortable questions about legality, and Karen responding to all of them with the same smug certainty, the same belief that she was untouchable. By 2 I was at the impound lot, staring through a chain-link fence at my truck, furious not just at the tow fee, but at the principle of it, at the fact that she'd used power she didn't have to punish me personally, and when I paid to get it released the guy at the desk leaned in and muttered, "This HOA stuff always ends bad," like he'd seen this movie before. I drove home in silence, parked exactly where I always had, and waited, and sure enough within 20 minutes Karen was back, this time with 2 board members in tow, both of them looking uncomfortable, both of them avoiding my eyes, while she launched into a speech about repeat violations and escalating consequences, waving papers she hadn't bothered to read, and when I told her calmly that what she'd done was illegal and that she'd be hearing from my attorney, she laughed again and said, "Good luck," because she genuinely believed the HOA was a shield, that the title on her email signature made her invincible. That night I couldn't sleep, not because I was scared, but because my mind wouldn't stop turning, replaying every meeting, every threat, every smirk, and somewhere between midnight and dawn, I realized something that made me smile in the dark, something Karen had never bothered to learn about me because she'd been too busy assuming I was just another homeowner she could bully. The land this entire development sat on had a history, and I knew that history very well because before it was a neighborhood, before it was manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, it had been something else entirely, something with easements and access rights and agreements that never expired, and tied to those agreements was a facility just beyond the tree line, a place Karen had driven past 100 times without ever asking what it was, a place with gates and guards and equipment the size of houses, a place that, under certain conditions, had the legal right to enter the neighborhood without notice. And by sunrise, with my phone pressed to my ear and my voice steady, I was setting those conditions in motion, knowing that when Karen woke up and checked her notifications, she'd have no idea that the fight she thought she'd won had only just begun, and that the quiet street she ruled like a kingdom was about to learn what real authority looked like. By the next afternoon, the neighborhood felt wrong in a way that's hard to describe unless you've lived somewhere long enough to sense when the air itself has changed, when the usual soundtrack of lawn mowers and distant dogs is replaced by a brittle quiet full of whispers and half-glances, because Karen Whitfield had gone from smug to suspicious overnight, and suspicion for someone like her was the most dangerous phase of all. It started with emails, long frantic ones blasted to every resident, dripping with legal jargon she barely understood, insisting that the towing had been fully authorized, and that any rumors to the contrary were misinformation being spread by a disgruntled homeowner, which would have been laughable if they hadn't been followed by a hastily scheduled emergency HOA meeting at the clubhouse, attendance mandatory, capital letters and all, like she could summon obedience by sheer force of punctuation. I showed up early, sat in the back, and watched as people filtered in, whispering, checking their phones, casting looks at me they didn't bother to hide anymore, because by then everyone knew something was happening, something bigger than another fine or warning sticker, and Karen knew it too, which was why she'd brought backup. The HOA's contracted attorney, a thin man with a briefcase full of papers and a face that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, and the property manager, who avoided eye contact entirely and kept glancing at the exit like he was planning an escape route. Karen took the floor immediately, launching into a speech about order and authority, about how the HOA had to act decisively against threats to property values, and she kept saying the word commercial over and over like repetition could turn fiction into fact, until one of the older residents raised a hand and asked a simple question. Under what rule exactly had my truck been towed without notice? The room went quiet, and for the first time since this all began, Karen hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long, before gesturing to the attorney, who cleared his throat and said they were reviewing the specifics, which is lawyer speak for we messed up and we know it. That was when I stood up and calmly informed the room that I'd already been reimbursed for the tow fee, that my attorney was preparing a formal complaint for unlawful seizure and selective enforcement, and that any further action against my vehicle would be considered retaliation, and the reaction was immediate and visceral. Murmurs, gasps, heads snapping toward Karen, whose face flushed a dangerous shade of red as she slammed her hand on the table and accused me of intimidation, of threatening the HO, of trying to bully her into submission, and I almost laughed at the irony of it, because she'd spent months doing exactly that to me without a second thought. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that, people talking over each other, Karen shouting for orders she no longer had, and the attorney whispering urgently in her ear, and as I left, I caught fragments of conversation about lawsuits, about personal liability, about insurance not covering willful misconduct, words that should have terrified her, but instead only seemed to harden her resolve, because Karen doesn't back down when she's wrong, she doubles down, convinced that escalation itself is a strategy. That night, she took it further, ordering new signage installed at the entrance of the neighborhood declaring strict vehicle enforcement zone, and authorizing the tow company to patrol aggressively, a move so reckless it bordered on self-sabotage, because by morning, 3 other residents had been towed as well, people who'd never had issues before, people who were now furious, and suddenly the problem wasn't just me, it was a growing block of angry homeowners demanding answers. While Karen fought fires she'd started herself, I was busy elsewhere, digging through county records and dusty agreements, confirming what I already knew but needed documented beyond any doubt. The easement running through the back of the neighborhood wasn't just for utilities, it was a legacy access corridor tied to a federal logistics facility that predated the HOA by decades, a facility whose rights were carved into contracts written so broadly they might as well have been etched in stone. And those rights included unrestricted entry of heavy equipment during declared operational readiness events, a term so vague it had been the subject of lawsuits in other states, all of which the facility had won. By Wednesday, official-looking vehicles began appearing near the tree line, unmarked but unmistakably government, their presence subtle enough that most residents didn't notice. But Karen did, because she noticed everything that threatened her control, and she immediately fired off another email accusing me of coordinating unauthorized access and security risks. CSNG, the local police department, in a move so ill-advised it would have been funny if it hadn't revealed just how far out of her depth she was. The police responded, professionally and briefly, stating they had no jurisdiction over federal easements, a sentence that might as well have been written in another language for Karen, who interpreted it not as a warning but as a challenge. She marched to the gate near the easement with a clipboard and her phone, live streaming herself confronting a pair of uniformed guards who listened politely as she demanded credentials, demanded explanations, demanded compliance with HOA rules, and when one of them calmly told her she was interfering with authorized operations, she lost it, shouting about property values and community consent, and that video, unlike her earlier bragging, spread far beyond the neighborhood because there's something irresistibly viral about watching a self-appointed authority figure try to boss around people who clearly don't answer to her. By the time the sun set, the comments were brutal, neighbors embarrassed, outsiders mocking, and Karen's name, once whispered with annoyance, now spoken with open contempt, but she still didn't stop, because stopping would mean admitting she was wrong, and for Karen that was unthinkable. Late that night, as I sat on my porch listening to distant engines hum beyond the trees, my phone buzzed with a single text from a number I hadn't saved but recognized instantly, short and precise. Operational window confirmed. Entry scheduled. I looked out at the quiet street, the identical houses, the manicured lawns Karen had tried so hard to control, and I wondered how she'd react when she realized that no amount of emails, no number of fines, no tantrum thrown in the middle of the road could stop what was coming next, because authority, real authority, doesn't argue in Facebook groups or HOA meetings. It arrives on steel tracks, weighs more than her entire illusion of power combined, and doesn't ask permission. The first sign that something irreversible was happening came just after dawn, when the ground itself seemed to sigh, a low vibration rolling through the neighborhood so subtle at first that most people mistook it for distant thunder or construction noise, but those of us awake felt it under our feet, a tremor that didn't belong to the quiet suburban rhythm Karen had tried so desperately to choreograph. Curtains twitched, garage doors creaked open a few inches, and phones came out as people stepped onto porches, confused, curious, and faintly uneasy, because the sound was growing louder, deeper, accompanied by a metallic clatter that echoed off the houses like a warning. From the far end of the street, beyond the line of ornamental trees Karen had insisted on planting to screen unsightly views, a shape emerged that didn't fit any category their minds were prepared for, a slab of armored steel moving with slow, deliberate certainty, tracks biting into asphalt like it was nothing more than packed dirt, escorted by a pair of utility vehicles bearing no logos anyone recognized but carrying an authority no one questioned. The tank, because there was no other word for it, was enormous, a 25-ton beast painted in dull, utilitarian green, its presence so absurdly out of scale with the identical houses and manicured lawns that the scene felt like a glitch in reality, like two incompatible worlds colliding without warning. People froze, mouths open, children tugging at parents' sleeves, dogs barking themselves hoarse, and then Karen appeared, charging down the street in heels and a blazer, clipboard in one hand and phone in the other, screaming before she was even close enough to be heard clearly, her voice shrill and furious as she waved her arms like she could physically push the machine back where it came from. She planted herself directly in front of it, feet wide, chin lifted, live streaming to an audience that had swelled from dozens to thousands overnight, shouting about trespass, about HOA authority, about how she did not consent to this, as if consent had ever been part of the equation. One of the escort vehicles stopped, a uniformed officer stepping out slowly, hands visible, posture calm, and tried to explain again that the operation was authorized under a federal easement, that the neighborhood was not being invaded, that no one was in danger, but Karen talked over him, accusing him of intimidation, of threatening residents, of violating community rules, and when he finally raised his voice just enough to be heard, telling her to step aside for her own safety, she laughed. A high, brittle sound, and declared that she wasn't afraid of props and scare tactics. That was the moment the tank's engine revved, not aggressively, not threateningly, but enough to remind everyone present that this was not a prop, that it was a machine designed for environments far more hostile than a cul-de-sac, and the effect was immediate and profound. People stepped back instinctively, even Karen's supporters retreating behind parked cars, but Karen herself stood frozen, shock flickering across her face for the first time, because she finally understood that no amount of shouting would change what was happening. The local police arrived next, lights flashing, officers spilling out and conferring with the escort team, radios crackling, and within minutes the balance of authority was visibly clear. The HOA president reduced to a bystander as uniforms ignored her demands and focused instead on safety perimeters and traffic control. Karen tried to insert herself anyway, thrusting her clipboard at anyone who would look, citing bylaws and fines and emergency powers she did not have. And when an officer calmly told her to step back behind the line, she snapped, accusing him of siding with me, of corruption, of conspiracy, and that outburst, captured from a dozen angles by neighbors and news crews who had arrived faster than anyone expected, was the final crack in her carefully maintained image. Reporters asked questions she couldn't answer, residents shouted accusations she couldn't deflect, and the livestream comments scrolled so fast they blurred into a wall of mockery and disbelief, because watching someone try to assert HOA rules over a tank was the kind of spectacle the internet lives for. Through it all, I stayed on my porch, silent, observing, knowing better than to gloat, because the real damage wasn't the embarrassment, it was the exposure, the undeniable proof that Karen's power existed only as long as people believed in it, and belief evaporates quickly when confronted with reality. As the tank rolled past, careful and controlled, escorted through the easement corridor exactly as the decades-old agreements allowed, it left behind not destruction, but humiliation, a clear, undeniable message written not in threats or emails, but in steel and authority. This neighborhood was not Karen's kingdom and never had been. When the operation concluded and the convoy disappeared back beyond the trees, the street was left buzzing with voices, questions, and a stunned silence that settled over Karen like a weight she couldn't shake, because for the first time, everyone saw her not as a leader, but as a liability, and she knew it, standing there alone, phone still recording, her reflection warped in the dark glass of a patrol car, realizing far too late that the fight she'd picked over my truck had just run her over. The aftermath didn't explode all at once the way Karen's meltdowns did. It unraveled slowly, relentlessly, like a thread pulled from a sweater until there was nothing left to hide the damage. And by the end of the week, the neighborhood she once ruled through fear and fines barely recognized her authority at all. It began quietly, with doors closing and conversations stopping when she walked by, with emails from residents demanding explanations she could no longer dodge, with the HOA board members who had once nodded along to her every demand suddenly discovering spines and legal counsel of their own, because nothing clarifies responsibility faster than realizing your name might be attached to a lawsuit. The management company was the first to distance itself, issuing a carefully worded notice explaining that certain actions taken by the HOA president had been outside the scope of approved procedures, a sentence that might as well have been a neon sign reading "You're on your own." And when Karen stormed into their office demanding support, she left empty-handed, her threats meaningless now that everyone knew how hollow they were. The formal complaints followed, not just mine but those of the other residents she'd had towed in her reckless escalation, each one documenting selective enforcement, lack of due process, and personal harassment. And when the HOA's insurer reviewed the claims, they made it brutally clear that intentional misconduct voided coverage, meaning any damages would come out of personal pockets. A reality Karen had never considered because she'd always assumed the HOA would absorb the consequences of her behavior. Emergency meetings were called again, this time without her at the head of the table, and the tone was different. Measured, cautious, legal, because the board finally understood that power exercised without restraint isn't leadership, it's liability, and when a motion was introduced to suspend Karen pending investigation, it passed unanimously, even from members who'd once defended her, because self-preservation has a way of cutting through loyalty. Karen didn't take the news well, of course. She sent rambling emails accusing everyone of betrayal, of cowardice, of siding with outside forces against their own community, but those messages were met with silence, the most devastating response of all for someone who thrives on attention. And when she showed up at the next meeting uninvited, demanding to speak, she was escorted out by security, her protests echoing down the hallway as neighbors watched with a mix of relief and disbelief at how quickly the balance had shifted. The legal consequences landed soon after, formal letters outlining potential personal liability for unlawful towing, harassment, and interference with federally authorized operations. Words so severe they drained the color from her face when she finally read them, because for the first time, there was no committee, no title, no email signature to hide behind, just her name at the top of documents that could follow her for years. The neighborhood itself changed too, not overnight, but steadily as residents who'd been quiet out of fear began speaking up, questioning rules, attending meetings, pushing for transparency, because Karen's downfall had exposed a truth they could no longer ignore. The HOA only had as much power as they allowed it, and unchecked authority was a problem, not a solution. As for me, the resolution was almost anticlimactic. My truck stayed exactly where it belonged, untouched, unchallenged, a silent reminder of a battle that had never really been about parking, and when my attorney confirmed the settlement, fees reimbursed, fines dismissed, formal apologies issued, it felt less like victory and more like closure because the real win wasn't the money or the vindication. It was watching an entire community learn the difference between rules and control. The last time I saw Karen weeks later, she was loading boxes into her car, eyes down, movements stiff, the confidence that once defined her replaced by something smaller and quieter, and as she drove away without a word, the street felt lighter, freer, like a pressure valve had finally been released. The tank never returned, of course. It had done its job without firing a shot, without damaging a single home, proving in the most dramatic way possible that real authority doesn't need to shout, doesn't need to threaten, and certainly doesn't need to tow a man's truck to feel powerful. And as life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, there was one unspoken agreement everyone seemed to share now. No one would ever again confuse an HOA title with absolute power, because they'd all seen what happens when illusion meets reality, and loses. By the time Karen realized suspension wasn't the end of it, only the beginning, the narrative she'd spent years crafting around herself had already collapsed, and what replaced it was far uglier than she ever imagined, because losing power doesn't just take away authority, it exposes everything that authority was hiding. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected, not because the board suddenly became brave, but because the evidence was overwhelming. Emails sent from Karen's personal account instructing the tow company to act immediately regardless of resistance, recordings of meetings where she overruled objections, screenshots of her live streams threatening residents with fines she had no right to impose, all stitched together into a timeline that showed not a single mistake, but a pattern of deliberate abuse. Residents who'd once stayed silent now came forward in waves, telling stories that sounded eerily familiar: cars towed after personal disputes, fines issued without notice, violations invented and then enforced with ruthless consistency. And each testimony tightened the noose a little more, until the board's attorney advised them bluntly that distancing themselves wasn't enough, that formal removal was the only way to limit the damage. Karen fought it like she fought everything else, sending cease and desist letters she'd copied from the internet, threatening defamation suits against neighbors who spoke out, accusing the board of staging a coup, but none of it worked, because intimidation only functions when people are afraid, and fear evaporates once you see the bully lose. The vote to permanently remove her passed in a closed session she wasn't allowed to attend, and when the official notice was delivered, stripped of titles, stripped of authority, barred from representing the HOA in any capacity, she screamed so loudly neighbors later said they could hear it from the street, the sound of someone realizing that control, once lost, never returns the same way. But the legal fallout didn't stop with removal, because consequences have a way of compounding, and Karen soon found herself named individually in a civil suit filed by 3 homeowners, citing harassment, unlawful seizure, and emotional distress, a case the HOA refused to defend, making it clear that this was her mess alone. Her attempts to crowdfund legal fees failed spectacularly, the campaign mocked online by people who remembered the tank video and had no sympathy left to give, and as bills mounted and attorneys stopped returning her calls, the confidence she once wielded like a weapon drained away, replaced by desperation that showed in every frantic message she sent. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued to change without her, rules rewritten, enforcement policies clarified, power redistributed in ways that made future abuse far more difficult. And watching it all unfold was strangely sobering, because the story had stopped being about revenge and started being about accountability, about how systems meant to serve communities can rot when one person is allowed to dominate them unchecked. I saw Karen one afternoon standing alone by the clubhouse, staring at the notice board where her name had been removed from every listing, replaced by interim committees and transparent processes, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt a flicker of something like pity, not because she didn't deserve what happened, but because she still didn't understand it, still believed she'd been wronged rather than exposed. That misunderstanding would follow her long after the lawsuits ended, long after the neighborhood moved on, because the hardest lesson for people like Karen isn't losing power, it's realizing they never truly earned it in the first place. Court didn't look anything like Karen had imagined it would back when she still believed loud confidence could substitute for preparation, because there are no live streams in a courtroom, no comment sections to rally, no gavel you can shout over once it comes down, and from the moment she walked in clutching an overstuffed folder of irrelevant papers, it was obvious she was no longer in a space she could dominate. The room was quiet, controlled, and indifferent to her feelings, and that indifference rattled her more than hostility ever could, because judges don't react to theatrics, they wait, they listen, and then they decide. Karen tried to seize the narrative immediately, interrupting opening statements to insist that the entire case was retaliation, that she was being targeted for doing her job, that homeowners like me were abusing the system to punish her for enforcing rules, but the judge shut her down with a single raised hand and a calm reminder that she would speak when instructed, not when she felt like it, a moment that drained the color from her face and drew a barely audible murmur from the gallery. The evidence followed, methodical and merciless. Emails projected onto a screen showing her explicit instructions to tow vehicles without notice, recordings of meetings where she dismissed legal concerns, contracts highlighting exactly what authority she did and did not have, each piece building on the last until the pattern was impossible to ignore. And when witnesses took the stand, neighbors she'd fined, threatened, embarrassed publicly, Karen's composure cracked further because these weren't enemies or outsiders, they were people who had once nodded politely as she passed, people she'd assumed would stay silent forever. She tried to object, to argue relevance, to inject commentary from her seat, but every attempt was met with the same firm response from the judge, whose patience thinned visibly with each interruption, until Karen's attorney, now visibly overwhelmed, leaned over and whispered for her to stop talking, advice she ignored at her own peril. When it was finally her turn to testify, she spoke fast and defensively, contradicting herself without realizing it, insisting she acted on advice she couldn't document, claiming ignorance of bylaws she'd previously quoted verbatim, and the more she talked, the worse it became, because truth doesn't require improvisation, but lies do, and hers tangled quickly. The moment that sealed it came when she tried to shift blame onto me directly, accusing me of orchestrating the tank incident to humiliate her, of manipulating federal agencies to scare the HOA, and the judge leaned forward then, eyes sharp, and asked a single devastating question. Did she dispute the existence of the easement that authorized the operation? And when she hesitated before muttering no, the judge nodded once and said, "Then your opinion of it is irrelevant," a sentence that landed like a hammer. The ruling, when it came, was precise and unambiguous, finding Karen personally liable for unlawful towing and harassment, ordering restitution, legal fees and damages, and referring additional matters for further review, words that echoed in the sudden silence as Karen sat frozen, staring straight ahead, finally understanding that this wasn't a setback she could spin, but a record that would follow her indefinitely. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited, and for once she had nothing to say, no statement prepared, no righteous speech queued up, just a woman shrinking under the weight of consequences she'd spent years pretending didn't apply to her. And as I walked past without a word, I realized that the most fitting end to her reign wasn't anger or revenge, but the quiet finality of a system she'd abused now holding her accountable, because authority borrowed without restraint always comes due, and when it does, it collects with interest. Time has a way of sanding the sharpest moments down to something smoother, but some lessons leave grooves deep enough that they never fully disappear, and months after the courtroom emptied and the headlines moved on, the neighborhood settled into a version of itself that felt quieter, not because nothing happened anymore, but because the wrong kind of noise was finally gone. Karen didn't vanish overnight, consequences rarely work that cleanly, and for a while her presence lingered like an echo, her name still whispered when new rules were discussed or when someone hesitated before enforcing a policy, but gradually even that faded, replaced by a collective understanding that what had happened wasn't an anomaly, it was a warning, one the community took seriously enough to change. The HOA restructured itself completely, term limits imposed, enforcement powers narrowed, transparency baked into every process, not because anyone wanted another Karen, but because no one wanted the conditions that allowed her to thrive, and watching those changes take root was oddly satisfying in a way that revenge never could be, because it meant the damage she'd done wouldn't be easily repeated. As for Karen, the fallout followed her beyond the neighborhood, into job interviews that stalled when background checks flagged litigation, into social circles that quietly distanced themselves, into a life that no longer rewarded the traits she once leaned on so heavily, and while I didn't track her movements or relish her struggles, I'd occasionally hear updates secondhand, each one smaller than the last, each one a reminder that reputations, once cracked, rarely return to their original shit. The tank became a story people told with a laugh after enough time had passed, an almost mythical image that sounded exaggerated to outsiders, but for those of us who were there, it remained a symbol, not of intimidation or spectacle, but of the moment illusion finally collided with reality and lost. And whenever new residents moved in and asked about the easement, the answers were given calmly, matter-of-factly, without drama, because the lesson no longer needed theatrics to be understood. My own life slipped back into its familiar rhythm, truck parked where it always had been, mornings quiet again, disputes resolved with conversations instead of threats, and sometimes, standing on the same porch where I'd once watched authority roll by on steel tracks, I thought about how close it all had come to ending differently if fear had won, if silence had seemed easier, if challenging power had felt too risky. The truth was simpler and heavier at the same time. Karen hadn't been defeated by a tank or by lawyers or even by the law itself, but by exposure, by the moment everyone saw clearly what unchecked authority looks like when stripped of its costume, and that clarity lingered long after the spectacle faded. Years from now, no one will remember the exact fines she issued or the meetings she dominated, but they will remember the feeling of that morning, the ground vibrating, the realization dawning, the shared understanding that some lines, once crossed, invite consequences no amount of shouting can undo. And in that sense, the story didn't end with her downfall, but with a quiet agreement written into the culture of the place itself. Power is only legitimate when it's accountable, and anyone who forgets that should remember how quickly an HOA kingdom can crumble when reality finally shows up. Even after everything settled, after policies were rewritten and faces on the board changed, the ripple effects of what Karen did continued to surface in quieter, more unexpected ways, the kind you don't notice until you stop and look back, because power abuse doesn't just harm its immediate target, it reshapes behavior long after it's gone. New neighbors moved in with the usual optimism, unaware of the history at first, but they learned quickly, not through warnings or fear, but through openness, through meetings where questions were welcomed instead of punished, through a culture that had been scarred enough to value restraint, and it struck me how rare that kind of growth actually is, how many communities repeat the same mistakes simply because no one ever forces a reckoning. The HOA, once a source of tension and dread, became almost boring, which was the greatest compliment it could earn, handling maintenance and budgets without drama, enforcing rules consistently and sparingly, and when disputes arose, they were resolved with documentation and dialogue rather than threats. A quiet proof that systems don't need strong personalities to function, only clear limits and shared accountability. Occasionally, someone would bring up Karen's name, usually in disbelief, usually prefaced with, "Can you imagine?" And each time it felt more distant, more like a cautionary tale than a fresh wound, a reminder passed down not to scare people into compliance, but to show them the cost of apathy, because what allowed her rise wasn't just her personality, it was everyone else's willingness to look away when the early signs appeared. For me, the experience changed how I approached conflict entirely, stripping away the illusion that staying quiet is the same as keeping peace, and teaching me instead that peace maintained by fear is just silence waiting to break. A lesson I carried into every interaction afterward, whether with neighbors, officials, or institutions that rely on people not pushing back. There was no grand final confrontation left, no last speech or dramatic reveal, just the slow normalization of fairness, the most sustainable ending imaginable, and in that normalization lay the real victory, because the neighborhood didn't need another spectacle to remember what happened. It needed proof that learning was possible. On warm evenings, when the street was filled again with ordinary sounds, kids riding bikes, neighbors talking, engines starting without incident, I sometimes thought about how surreal it all would sound to someone hearing it secondhand, how absurd the image of a tank rolling through a suburban HOA would seem without context, and yet how fitting it was as a metaphor, because sometimes the only thing that stops an illusion of absolute control is reality arriving in a form too heavy to ignore. The story ended not with triumph or defeat, but with perspective, with an understanding shared quietly among those who lived it that authority should always be questioned, that rules should always be examined, and that the moment someone claims power without accountability, the countdown has already begun because eventually, one way or another, reality show.